Chief of Mindfulness is a tongue-in-cheek title. I hope you thought that already. It's not serious. How many of you in this room have learnt anything that would come under the heading of meditation? Yeah, look at it. I mean, well over half the room. If I'd asked that question 20 years ago, everybody would sort of shuffle or look down. And then in the coffee break, somebody would come up and say, you know that question about meditation? Well, I've been doing it myself. But it was kind of closet meditation. Right? They didn't do it. And now it's all very, very much changed, of course. So here what we're looking at, considering, of course, is the role of well-being and innovation, and how does that link? Well, I guess the very first way of looking at that is, if you think of the you that you know when you're at your best, how productive, effective, creative, and so on are you? There's a term here, of course. Part of the organization's name that I work for is Flo Wellbeing. But of course, we know that term in a different context as well, don't we? In sports, they call it the zone. In jazz musicians, we'll call it being in the pocket. And then there's the state of flow. And we all know that in one sense or another. And the way I often describe that is to say, well, it's the you that you know when you're at your best. But what are some of the qualities that you have? What are you experiencing when you're in that kind of place, when you're in flow? What are you noticing? Sorry? Peaceful, okay, yes, yeah, there's a kind of centeredness about it. Yep, what else? How effective are you? Highly effective, yeah, absolutely, yes. Switched on, very much, yeah, there's a high level of focus. What about how hard or easy it is? It's just, I mean, the name flow itself, it's easy. And what about time? Time seems to sort of become very elastic, doesn't it? It's as though you've got, particularly sports people, they find that even though there's the pressure and the intensity of the game going on around them, when they're fully in the zone, it's as though time just expands and they've got the time they need to do what they're doing. And then if you expand that out to teams, well, I mean, you've seen teams when they get those magic moments and they go into flow on the field. It's like they don't even have to look where they're passing the ball because someone will be there. Everybody's operating as though they're linked intrinsically at a level that goes beyond just the ordinary conceptual and so on. There's a group think, a group way of operating. Now, why I've said that and gone into that is, you may or may not know this, because there's now so much research on the way that our brains work. Because we didn't used to have the technology to be able to look at what's actually going on in live brains. And here's one of those understandings. It takes a long time for what's going on in laboratories to get out into the public domain. What's one of the sort of colloquial terms we use for when we talk about the brain? We call it the old what? The old grey matter, yes. Yeah, the old grey matter. Well, that was research based on that we had at the time was we couldn't work on live brains. We didn't have the technology. The only brains we could work on were dead brains. And dead brains are indeed grey. But live brains are what? What color are they? Pink, yeah, like any other healthy organ in the body. Yeah, indeed. But there's that long gap between what goes on in the lab and what gets out into the public domain. Now, what we also know, because of the amount of research now, is that there are highly correlated brain states with different aspects of experience. So that when you're in flow, there is a very particular bunch of circumstances that's going on in your brain, that's measurable, that's identifiable. When you're being creative, when you're being innovative, just in the same way that when you're asleep, for example, there's a whole bunch of brainwave patterns and rhythms that are going on. If you were wired up to the equipment that measures all that sort of stuff, a researcher could just look at the printouts, and without seeing you at all, they'd be able to say, this person is asleep and in deep sleep, or this person is asleep and dreaming, or this person is in the waking state. That's how specific that kind of research has become now. Now, when you are in a highly focused flow state, some of the stuff that's going on in your brain is this. You know, we've all got two hemispheres of the brain, of course, we all know that. The two hemispheres of the brain, a lot of the time, are not very coordinated. They're not in synchrony. You'll get amplitude and frequency of rhythm on one side that might be going like that, and on the other side it might be going like that. But in those moments of flow, guess what happens? Those two parts of your brain, the two hemispheres of the brain, go into synchrony, and they start to coordinate like that. And not only that, the more in that state you are, the more coherent is the word that's used your brain becomes, all of it functioning, back, front, left, right, all linked up and focused. Now, the opposite is the more dysfunctional or the more stressed we are, the more fragmented that'll show up on the equipment that measures your brain. It's all fragmented, it's all sort of going all over the place. Now, why I've gone through that at all is there are ways of training the brain to access more and more of those states. Now, wouldn't it be nice if there was a button marked on for flow? Yeah, I want to be from flow today, on, boom. Of course, it doesn't work like that. But one of my teachers had a great phrase for it, and this is where the become accident prone comes from. He said, there's no button marked on for flow. It's like an accident. He said, but what you can do is become accident prone. And what he meant by that was do the kind of stuff that helps you practice accessing the brain state that is correlated with flow. Now, wouldn't that be a useful thing to do? That's what the sort of thing that we do at Flo, is at Flo Wellbeing. How do you actually access that? How do you practice it? Now, let's look at the other side of the situation. Present day corporate life. How many of you experience corporate life, either yourself or your team or your people? It's pretty pressured. Yeah? How many of you find that? Corporate life these days is pretty pressured. Okay. Something else that's different about it now, certainly from when I started working, was that, of course, it's always on. It didn't used to be that way. You went to work, 9 to 5 or whatever it was, and then you went home, and the two things were quite separate. But now, of course, because of technology, which has got all sorts of upsides, but it's always on. In fact, a lot of people who work these days are expected to be able to be connected or accessed 24/7. It's indicative, the vast amount of information that we have to deal with. And then add on to top of that the level of distractions, just the endless sort of technology, et cetera, all the sort of stuff that you have to deal with. How on earth do we manage to deal with all that sort of stuff in a way that's not just effective, but and not even just about surviving it, to actually thrive in that context? Of course, you've all heard of Accenture. You know of Accenture, the consultants. They came up with a great phrase fairly recently, which is, today, folks, this is an attention economy. It's an attention economy because it's become such a resource, such a valuable resource, because there is so much demand and draw on our attention all the time. Now, let's just put the opposite part to it here. When you've had a really lousy night's sleep, how effective are you next day? I mean, it's survival, isn't it? It's survival until you can get through and hopefully get a good night's sleep tonight, as it were. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end is, how do you maximize what you've got to really be present, focused, clear, calm, et cetera, and be highly effective? I mean, how many of you, for example, exercise in whatever form? Okay, so I mean, you all understand the principle behind that. Of course we do that. Because the fitter you are, the stronger you feel, the more alive and energized and all the rest of it. Now, you can do the same with your brain as well. Actually, let's just involve our bodies right now. Now, this isn't going to be physical jokes, okay? But can I invite you all to come to your feet? You see, it's really useful to involve our bodies wherever we show up. And what I mean by that is, the body is an enormous resource in itself. And it only requires a few things to keep it happy. Bodies are very literal, very simple. To keep a body happy, they like to breathe, they like to move, and they like to make sound. That's it. I mean, of course, you've got to eat and sleep and all those kind of things, but in terms of ongoing moment to moment, breathe, move, make sound. So let's just do this. Can I invite you all just to simply stretch up? Now, as I said, this isn't physical jokes. This is more just physical awareness, just moving. So don't do anything that's going to exacerbate any kind of injury that you've already got. But stretching over to your right. Yeah, and that was the first test. Well done. Just feel your ribcage opening up like a fan on that side. Very good. And then the other side, and feel that ribcage opening up like a fan. Just breathe into it. Ah, yes. Make fists. Put them in the small of your back. Let down in your knees. Now, careful with this one if you have any back problems, okay? Just lean back over your fists and say, ah, doesn't that feel good? I didn't say come up. All right, up you come. And gently bending forwards and touch your toes. And it's interesting the way that everybody tries to do that. I just said bend forward and touch your toes. You can do it the hard way, you can do it the easy way, but we're intricately connected. And the more static the body becomes, that gets reflected throughout. I mean, a lot of you probably already experienced this when you start to feel sort of stuck and sort of getting cloudy and so on. What's one of the things you do? You get up and walk, move, and so on. But you can incorporate that. There are intelligent ways of doing all this stuff to make the most of what you've got. Now, this is really what I built a career out of, is I was always focused on how do we make the most of what we've got in terms of body, mind, and spirit. And so one thing is to become accident prone. How do you work to do that? The other is, don't just do something, sit there. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Because, of course, we're so focused on action, making things happen, and so on and so forth. But I already asked you, what's it like when you've had a really lousy night's sleep? How effective are we next day? There is a direct relationship between our ability to rest and our capacity for action and involvement. And we have something called a relaxation response. This is probably, I use the words meditation. When I say we moved from it being very weird and strange and hippy-dippy right to the other extreme, I ended up working with McKinsey for 10 years. I went there to set up a new department within McKinsey. It was focused entirely on the culture side of organizations, the people side of things. And we taught meditation to both McKinsey and to their clients worldwide. Although we didn't call it meditation because the word had far too much baggage. We called it the high-performance mind technique. It's what's in the name. Because again, there's so much research to validate that now. And occasionally somebody would say, well, isn't this a bit like meditation? And they'd all say it like that, of course. And we just got good at dodging the question and saying things like, well, that's one of those words that covers a multitude of different ways of thinking and so on and so forth. But this is the high-performance mind technique, and we'd get past it like that. Now, the most neutral way of talking about meditation that I've come across is from a researcher at Harvard called Herbert Benson. And Benson calls it the relaxation response, learning how to trigger your relaxation response. Now, everybody's got a relaxation response. It already works for you, and here's how it works. If you're doing something that involves a high level of activity, so your metabolic rate will be high, like running, say, then of course, you're breathing lots, your heart rate's pounding, and so on and so forth. Now, when you stop running and start walking, something happens that's the bleeding obvious, but I need to make a point about it. The obvious is this. When you start walking after running, everything begins to quieten down. Your heart rate calms down, your breathing calms down, that's the obvious. The point is you didn't have to do anything to make that happen. You didn't have to kind of talk your heart down. Okay, heart, come on, I'm just walking now. Down you come, baby, down you go. That's it. Of course, nonsense. It's inbuilt, it's automatic. Then if you've been walking for a while and you sit, same thing happens again. You'll quieten down even further. And once you've been sitting for a while, you'll find that you quieten even more. You kind of get to a point where you plateau and you don't get any quieter. Now, that plateau point, in mechanical terms, you might call it your idle point, is a shifting number, point, just like, in fact, cars used to be before they had computers on board. Because before cars had computers on board, if you didn't get the car serviced, what you would sometimes find is that the timing of the engine would go. And it would either get stuck lower or higher. And of course, if the timing on the engine gets stuck low, what would happen at the traffic lights when you pulled up and took your foot off the accelerator? Stall, absolutely. And if the engine got stuck higher, what happens when you take your foot off the accelerator? It's still revving, yeah. And the guy in the next car thinks you want to do a drag race. I think, no, it's got stuck. Now, that can happen with us. Stress builds incrementally. And if you don't have a way of resolving it. And the way that it starts to build, of course, is initially you don't really notice it much, that idle point starting to get stuck a little higher. But when it starts to get to a certain point, the symptoms will show up. And one of the first places it shows up is difficulty in sleeping. You find it either difficult to get to sleep or to stay asleep. And what's the common thing that we say? What's the phrase that so many people use when they can't get to sleep? I couldn't get to sleep because... Yeah. Brain was racing. I couldn't switch off. And that's quite literally what's happened. Your idle point has got stuck too high. Now, this is why it's a very useful thing to be able to do, to learn how to trigger your relaxation response, because it's like recalibrating your idle point. But it's not just that. It actually can trigger it to go far, far lower than it would by just sitting and relaxing and so on. Let me just give you one stat here. Would you agree that probably the deepest rest that most people know would be their deep sleep? And if you're wearing the equipment that measures metabolic rate, you'll find that your metabolic rate will drop somewhere between 8 and 12% in your deep sleep. And what we know these days is that there's a kind of epidemic of poor sleep going on. People are not sleeping well. That's evidenced by the vast number of millions of scripts that are written for sleeping pills every year in Australia. Knowing how to trigger your relaxation response effectively, you can drop your metabolic rate anything up to 15 to 18%. That's getting on for twice the depth of rest of our deepest sleep. And deep rest is the antidote to stress. It's in deep rest that you let go, that you resolve stress. So really what I'm really coming to here is that when we focus on well-being, the sophistication of understanding of what all that implies now, it's no longer just a nice to have, particularly in corporate life, to survive it, and more than survive it, to thrive within it, and to be able to build resilience. Resilience is not a capacity to endure. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. It's not that. Real resilience is how you recover so that you're ready for the next level of engagement. And sports teams know this, elite sports teams, of course. The game, of course, is a huge focus, but then there's an enormous focus on recovery. And it's the same for us in every aspect of our lives. So don't just do something, sit there is a recipe for high-level focus and activity, because you can rest far deeper than even deep sleep. So we start meetings with a few minutes of, we now call it meditation, not the high-performance mind anymore. Why? Because not just when individuals come to rest, but when a group of people come to rest deeply together, there's a level of attunement that goes on, that goes way beyond just the ordinary conceptual level that you might tune into. There's a level of attunement out of which, when you come out of it and get into focus and activity, the level of creativity, innovation, and energy that arises is way, way more. Calm, clear, and focused from an aligned, coherent brain is what's really going to underpin you being the best that you can be.